The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Marcus wiped down the mahogany table in the executive boardroom, his calloused hands moving in practiced circles. It was 11 p.m., and while the corporate warriors had long since retreated to their suburban castles, he remained invisible, unnoticed, essential. His daughter's sketch was tucked in his shirt pocket, a crayon masterpiece of their tiny apartment that she'd drawn while waiting for him to finish his double shift. He'd promised her they'd go to the park this weekend. He'd promised her a lot of things lately. The city skyline glittered through the floor to ceiling, windows like a constellation of unfulfilled dreams. Marcus had worked at quantum technologies for 7 years, arriving when everyone left, leaving when the first executives trickled in with their expensive coffees and urgent phone calls. He knew every corner of this building, better than he knew the streets of his own neighborhood. He knew which CEO liked his office at exactly 68 degrees, which VP left personal notes scattered across her desk, and which meetings ran long enough that he'd have to come back later to finish cleaning. But he never knew their secrets until that night. Marcus was emptying the trash in conference room A when he noticed the papers. Not unusual. Executives were careless with documents, treating million-dollar contracts like grocery lists. But these papers were different. Even his untrained eye could see the urgency in the red ink, the frantic calculations, the word critical stamped across the top. He should have walked away, should have dumped the trash and moved on to the next room. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the sketch in his pocket reminding him of his daughter's questions. "Daddy, why do you work so much?" Maybe it was exhaustion making him curious. Or maybe it was something deeper, a lifetime of being invisible finally wanting to be seen. The documents detailed a catastrophic flaw in Quantum's new satellite system, a 50 million project set to launch in 3 days. The math was complex, but the conclusion was clear. If they launched as planned, the satellites would fail within weeks. $50 million would burn up in the atmosphere, along with the company's reputation and the jobs of 3,000 employees. Marcus's hands trembled as he set down his trash bag. He thought about his daughter, about the single mothers and fathers who worked in shipping, the young graduates in marketing, the security guard who always asked about his kid. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were people whose lives would shatter like his had when his wife passed away 3 years ago, leaving him alone with a 6-year-old and bills that never stopped coming. He pulled out the papers and studied them under the harsh lighting. The engineers had gotten tangled in complexity, their advanced degrees creating a maze of overthinking. But Marcus saw something they didn't. Years of fixing broken radiators, rewiring lamps from yard sales, and building furniture from scratch had taught him that sometimes the most complicated problems had the simplest solutions. His daughter always said he could fix anything. Could he fix this? Marcus found a blank piece of paper and began to sketch. His hands, more used to holding mops than pens, worked slowly but deliberately. He drew the satellite configuration but adjusted the angle of the solar panels. He modified the positioning sequence, using basic geometry he'd learned helping his daughter with homework. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't sophisticated, but looking at it, Marcus knew in his bones it would work. At 6 a.m., when CEO Jennifer Walsh arrived for her emergency meeting, she found Marcus waiting outside her office. He'd never spoken to her before, not really. A nod here, a good evening there, always with his eyes down, always deferring to his place in the hierarchy of worth. "Mr. Chen wants his office cooler," she'd once said, walking past him without breaking stride. But now Marcus stood tall, his uniform wrinkled from the long night, his eyes red from exhaustion, holding papers that could either save the company or get him fired for snooping. "Ma'am, I need 5 minutes," he said, his voice steady despite his hammering heart. Jennifer Walsh was a woman who'd clawed her way up in a male-dominated industry, who'd sacrificed weekends and holidays, who measured her worth in quarterly reports and shareholder satisfaction. She had 17 meetings scheduled that day. She didn't have 5 minutes, but something in Marcus's face made her pause. 2 minutes, she said, unlocking her office door. Marcus laid out his sketch on her pristine desk. He explained what he'd found, his words tumbling out in a rush of technical observations, mixed with apologetic disclaimers. I know I'm just a janitor, ma'am, but I think the problem is simpler than they're making it. If you adjust the panel angle by 15 degrees and delay the positioning, sequence by 40 seconds, the weight distribution balances out. It's like fixing a wobbly table. You don't need to rebuild the whole thing. You just need to adjust the legs. Jennifer stared at the sketch, then at Marcus, then back at the sketch. Wait here, she said, her voice tight. She returned 20 minutes later with Dr. Sarah Martinez, the lead engineer, whose face was pale with exhaustion and stress. The doctor studied Marcus's sketch in silence, her eyes moving rapidly across the simple diagram. She pulled out her tablet, ran calculations, checked parameters. Oh my God, she whispered. Oh my God, this works. This actually works. The emergency board meeting at 9 a.m. became the stuff of company legend. Jennifer Walsh stood before 12 board members, presenting the crisis and its solution. But she didn't stand alone. Marcus stood beside her, still in his janitor's uniform, as she explained. How a man they'd never noticed had saved their $50 million project with a simple sketch. This company almost made a catastrophic mistake, Jennifer said, her voice carrying across the stunned silence. But it wasn't our engineers who failed. They're brilliant people overwhelmed by an impossible timeline we imposed on them. It wasn't our systems that failed. It was our values. We failed because we created a culture where brilliance is only recognized when it comes from expected places, where we value credentials over insight, where we walk past people every single day without seeing their humanity, let alone their potential. She turned to Marcus, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Mr. Thompson has worked in this building for 7 years. 7 years. And until today, I didn't know his first name. I didn't know he has a daughter. I didn't know he was a Marine, corps engineer before. Circumstances forced him into a different path. We didn't know because we didn't ask. We didn't see him because we decided he was invisible. The board member reactions ranged from shame to shock, but Jennifer wasn't finished. Effective immediately, Marcus Thompson is our new Director of Practical Solutions, with a salary reflecting the value he brings to this company. He'll work directly with our engineering teams, providing real-world perspective and oversight. His first task will be reviewing all current projects for similar oversights. Marcus's legs nearly gave out. The salary she named was more than he'd made in 5 years. It meant his daughter could have new shoes, could join the soccer team, could go to the park whenever she wanted because he'd actually be home before dark. But Jennifer held up her hand. She wasn't done. Furthermore, we're establishing the Thompson Fellowship, a program to identify talent in unconventional places. Janitors, security guards, cafeteria workers, anyone in this building who has ideas, insights, or innovations. We almost lost everything because we stopped listening. That ends today. The satellite system launched successfully 3 days later, adjusted according to Marcus's specifications. It would go on to function flawlessly for 15 years, generating over $300 million in revenue. But the real transformation happened in the quiet moments that followed. Marcus eating lunch in the executive cafeteria, sharing stories about his daughter with engineers who'd finally learned to listen. The former security guard, who used the Thompson Fellowship to design a revolutionary safety protocol. The cleaning crew member whose organizational system was adopted company-wide, saving millions in efficiency gains. 6 months later, at the company's annual gala, Marcus stood on stage receiving the Innovation Award. His daughter sat in the front row, wearing a new dress, her face glowing with pride. Jennifer Walsh handed him the crystal trophy, but then did something that made the entire ballroom fall silent. She bowed. A slight bow, respectful and genuine, from a CEO to the man who'd reminded her what leadership really meant. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing what we couldn't, for caring when you had every reason not to, for proving that wisdom doesn't require a corner office, and courage doesn't need a title." Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, faces that now saw him, really saw him. He thought about the sketch still tucked in his wallet, his daughter's crayon drawing of their apartment. She'd added something new to it recently, a sun rising over the building, bright yellow with the words "My Daddy" written in her careful 6-year-old handwriting. "I just did what anyone would do," Marcus said softly into the microphone. "I saw people who needed help, and I knew how to help them. That's not innovation. That's just being human." But in a world that had forgotten how to value humanity over hierarchy, how to recognize worth beyond wealth, how to see the invisible people who keep everything running, it was revolutionary. And it changed everything.